Part 1, The Ink and the Blood. London, early spring. The rain had ceased only moments ago, leaving the cobblestone streets slick with silver reflections. A single black motor car rolled to a graceful halt before an old, ivy-clad building on Blackthorn Street, the Blackthorn House of Literature. Its high windows glowed faintly golden through the mist, and a brass plaque beside the door declared it a sanctuary for readers and writers since 1873. From the car emerged a small, compact man in a grey suit so immaculately pressed that it looked incapable of ever having known a wrinkle. His shoes shone like mirrors, his mustache was an art form, and his eyes, sharp, intelligent, and calculating, surveyed the facade with interest. Monsieur Hercule Poirot had arrived. Inside, the library was a cathedral of silence, polished oak shelves, high domed ceiling, and the faint, holy perfume of old books. Tonight, however, the quiet was softened by the murmur of an audience and the clinking of glasses. Candles flickered across the long tables, where London's literary elite had gathered to celebrate the launch of a much-anticipated new novel. The author was Miss Eleanor Vane, the celebrated Queen of Psychological Crime. Her previous works had torn open the darker corners of the human mind, and critics whispered that her new book, The Scarlet Manuscript, would surpass them all. Near the refreshments table, Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard raised a hand in greeting. "Well, well, Poirot. I didn't expect to find you at a literary soirée. Don't tell me you've turned critic." Poirot smiled faintly, arranging the crease of his gloves. "Non, mon ami. But I am always intrigued when murder finds its way into fiction. Sometimes, it leaves footprints in reality." Japp chuckled. "Let's hope the only blood tonight is the metaphorical sort." At 8 o'clock precisely, Eleanor Vane took the stage. She was tall, strikingly pale, with dark eyes that seemed to measure everyone in the room. In her hand she carried a leather-bound notebook, aged, worn, and tied with a crimson ribbon. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, "I give you the Scarlet Manuscript, a story written not just in ink, but in truth." The crowd applauded. The flash of a photographer's bulb illuminated her face for an instant, and in that flash, Poirot noticed something peculiar. On her left hand, near the thumb, was a faint, rusty red stain. Ink, perhaps. Or something darker. After the reading, champagne flowed freely, laughter mingled with cigarette smoke, and the scent of violets from Eleanor's perfume lingered in the air. Poirot approached her table with a courteous bow. "Mademoiselle, allow me to congratulate you. You have written a tale most macabre, yet, how shall I say, precise. Every word sits like a carefully placed clue." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You flatter me, Monsieur Poirot. I've heard your name, the great detective who sees truth in trifles." "And I," Poirot replied gently, "have heard yours, the writer who hides truth behind lies." Her smile faltered for a moment. Poirot's eyes flicked again to her stained fingers. "You have ink on your hand," he observed. "It is a curious shade." She looked down, almost amused. "A writer always bleeds a little when she writes." "Ah," said Poirot softly, "but sometimes, mademoiselle, the bleeding is not metaphorical." The evening stretched into quiet conversation and clinking glasses. Around midnight, the guests began to drift away. Poirot was just stepping out with Japp when a shrill cry echoed from within the library. They turned. The butler came running, his face white as parchment. "Miss Vane, she's collapsed." When they reached her study, Poirot stopped short. Eleanor Vane was slumped over her desk, her cheek resting against the open manuscript. A dark pool had spread beneath her, staining the pages a terrible scarlet. Her fountain pen lay on the carpet, its nib broken. The manuscript's first page was splattered, not with ink, but with blood. Japp cursed softly. "Good Lord, suicide." Poirot bent close, examining the desk, the floor, the way her body leaned against the chair. "No, no, my friend. Look, the pen is broken outward, as if it were struck, not dropped. And her hand, see the bruise near the wrist? Non, this is no suicide. This is murder, one written in blood. The police sealed the room. Poirot remained behind as others whispered in corridors. On the first page of the manuscript, written in bold, deliberate script, was a line that made even Japp frown. He who writes with deceit shall die by his own words. Poirot touched the ink, it was still tacky, as though written minutes before death. By morning, the press had exploded. Novelist found dead among her pages, read the headlines. Poirot and Japp began their inquiries immediately. There were 4 key witnesses. 1. Charles Greaves, Eleanor's publisher, a smooth-talking man in his 40s, who had discovered her years ago. She'd been nervous lately, he said. Obsessed with that manuscript. Wouldn't let anyone read it. Claimed it was her best work, and her last. 2. Violet Lane, a young aspiring writer and Eleanor's protégé. She told me someone was rewriting her book behind her back. She thought her notes had been stolen. 3. Dr. Adrian Lyle, literary critic, and Eleanor's public rival. We quarreled, yes. She accused me of plagiarism once. But she was unstable. Haunted, even. 4. Beatrice Holt, the librarian. I saw her receive an envelope yesterday evening. No address, just her name, in red ink. Poirot listened, saying little, but his mind worked tirelessly. A writer who feared her words being rewritten. A publisher with secrets. A critic with a grudge. And an envelope with no sender. Late that night, when the library had emptied of policemen and reporters, Poirot returned alone. He lit a single lamp and examined the manuscript again. The ink had dried now, black against the parchment, except for one curious thing. On several pages, between paragraphs, faint indentations could be seen, as if something had once been written there and later erased. He ran his fingers lightly across the marks and murmured, "There is a story beneath the story." Halfway through, he found a Latin phrase scrawled faintly in the margin. Veritas sanguine signator. Truth must be sealed in blood. Poirot sat back, thoughtful. A signature written in blood, but whose? The next morning brought new revelations. The forensic report arrived, traces of human blood mixed with ink had been found on Eleanor's fingers and the manuscript pages. Japp was bewildered. So she cut herself while writing? Poirot shook his head. Or someone else wrote with her blood. Japp groaned. You're impossible, Poirot. Next you'll tell me the killer dipped his pen right into her veins. Poirot merely raised a brow. Perhaps not so crudely, but, metaphorically, yes. He opened his notebook. Consider, mon ami, the message on the first page, he who writes with deceit shall die by his own words. Suppose it was not written by her, but by someone wishing to appear as her. Someone who wanted the scene to look like poetic justice. Japp frowned. A frame-up? Poirot nodded. A performance. The theater of murder. Later that day, Poirot asked to see Eleanor's private study in her townhouse on Grosvenor Square. There, among shelves of classic literature and old typewriters, he discovered something peculiar, a small locked drawer inside her writing desk. The key, conveniently, was missing, but Poirot's little grey cells were not defeated so easily. He noticed that one of the desk's handles bore a faint smear of red wax. He melted it gently with a candle stub, and the drawer popped open. Inside was a diary. The first pages were routine, deadlines, editor notes, musings about her next novel. But near the end, the handwriting changed, faster, slanted, and uneven. One entry read. He says he owns my words. That my stories are his ideas. He threatens to destroy me if I reveal the truth. But I will. I must. And beneath that. If anything happens to me, the truth lies between the lines. Poirot closed the diary slowly. Between the lines, yes, mademoiselle, you hide your clues even in death. That night, Poirot sat in his apartment at Whitehaven Mansions, the diary open before him. The city's lights glimmered faintly through the rain-spotted window. He reviewed the facts aloud, methodically, as he always did. The manuscript, written partly in blood. A quote about deceit and death. The locked-room nature of the crime. 4 suspects, each bound to Eleanor by words. And finally, the phrase, between the lines. He looked again at the manuscript's pages, which the police had permitted him to keep temporarily. Under the lamplight, he saw faint impressions, markings invisible to the naked eye. He dusted a little charcoal powder over them. Slowly, letters began to appear. It was another message, hidden within the text itself. He writes with my hand. He signs with my name. Poirot sat back, his eyes narrowing. Mon Dieu, a ghostwriter. The idea fascinated him, and frightened him, just a little. Someone had been rewriting Eleanor's work, perhaps using her notes, her drafts, even her very words. And now she was dead, her manuscript stained with blood, her final story completed not by her, but by her killer. Poirot whispered to himself. To kill an author and finish her book, that is murder by authorship. Outside, thunder rolled distantly over London. Poirot extinguished the lamp, his face half-lit by the lightning. He murmured softly, tomorrow, I shall pay a visit to Monsieur Charles Greaves. Publishers, after all, are the true readers of men. Part 2, The Daubs of Deceit. The following morning broke grey and reluctant over London. A fine drizzle drifted past the windows of Whitehaven Mansions as Hercule Poirot arranged the folds of his silk dressing-gown with mathematical precision. On the table before him lay the items of the case, a few photographs of the library crime scene, a copy of the Scarlet Manuscript, Eleanor Vane's diary, and a tiny envelope marked only with the initials C.G. He regarded them as a chess player regards his pieces. Every crime, he murmured, is a composition. The melody may deceive, but the harmony never lies. A knock on the door interrupted his reflection. It was Inspector Japp, rain-spattered and already irritable. Morning, Poirot. You look far too cheerful for a man investigating a murder written in blood. Poirot poured coffee for them both. Tell me, my friend, what news? Greaves, our publisher, swears blind he left the party before midnight. Claims he never went near Miss Vane's study. Did he mention the initials C.G.? Poirot asked, lifting the envelope delicately. Japp blinked. How the devil? We found that in her handbag this morning. Empty, no note inside. Poirot smiled faintly. Sometimes, mon ami, what a letter does not contain speaks louder than what it does. A publisher's alibi. An hour later they arrived at Greaves and Company, tucked behind Fleet Street, a narrow building smelling of ink and tobacco. Charles Greaves met them in his office, where the walls were lined with first editions and the carpet was the color of old parchment. My dear Inspector, Monsieur Poirot, he began with oily civility, this whole affair is ghastly. Poor Eleanor, such a brilliant woman. Poirot regarded him keenly. You published all her novels, did you not? Indeed. We had a fruitful partnership, though lately she become difficult. Secretive. She refused to show me her final manuscript until the launch itself. Quite against contract. Poirot's eyes twinkled. Contracts are interesting things, monsieur. They bind not only money, but authorship. Tell me, did Miss Vane ever accuse you of altering her work? Greaves laughed too quickly. Good heavens, no. Though I did, suggest edits. She could be sensitive. Poirot tapped the envelope on the desk. You recognize this? Greaves hesitated, then shrugged. My initials, yes, but I've never seen it before. Japp produced a sheet of paper. We also found this draft contract in your safe, Mr. Greaves. It lists you as co-author of the Scarlet Manuscript. Care to explain? Color drained from the publisher's face. A misunderstanding. It was an early draft, purely legal precaution. She'd given me permission, verbally. Poirot leaned forward. So you wish to share her fame? But, alas, she refused. And when she died, the manuscript, stained in her blood, became your property, non. Greaves stiffened. You're suggesting. I suggest nothing, Poirot said gently. I merely observe, greed is often disguised as admiration. The protégé's tears. Their next visit was to Violet Lane, the young writer who had worshipped Eleanor Vane. Her small flat smelled of coffee and turpentine, unfinished canvases leaned against the walls. She believed someone was stealing her words, Violet whispered, twisting her hands. Sentences she'd written would appear in magazine stories under other names. She blamed Charles Greaves, but she never had proof. Did she suspect anyone else? Poirot asked. Violet hesitated. There was a man, she met him at lectures. He claimed to be a literary historian, always asking about her notes. She called him the Ghost. I never knew his real name. Poirot's eyebrows rose. A ghost who writes, perhaps. Violet nodded, eyes glistening. She said he threatened her, that he could finish her stories better than she could. Japp scribbled furiously. Did you see this man? Once. Outside the library, 2 nights before she died. Tall, wearing gloves. When he saw me, he walked away. Poirot looked thoughtful. A ghost who leaves footprints. How inconvenient for a phantom. The critics' pride. That afternoon, drizzle gave way to wind. At the Times Literary Review office, Dr. Adrian Lyle received them with a sneer. Still chasing fiction, Inspector. I told you, I had no reason to kill Miss Vane. Poirot studied him. Yet you quarreled publicly. Lyle shrugged. She accused me of plagiarizing her psychological theories. Preposterous. I merely exposed her formulaic plotting. Perhaps, Poirot mused, she threatened to expose something more, substantial. Lyle's jaw tightened. You're wasting your time. I was lecturing at Oxford the night she died. Half the faculty can vouch for me. Poirot bowed slightly. Then you will forgive us for verifying, monsieur. As they left, Japp muttered, he's smug enough to kill for a bad review. Perhaps, said Poirot, but vanity rarely stains its hands, it hires others to do so. The hidden pages. That evening, Poirot returned once more to the Blackthorn House library. The police had released the premises, and only the caretaker remained. Poirot wandered through the dim aisles until he reached Eleanor Vane's desk. Something troubled him. On the floor near the chair lay a faint smudge, dark, irregular, like a bootprint half erased. He bent closer, the sole pattern matched the expensive Italian shoes worn by Charles Greaves earlier that day. Greaves, again, he murmured. A publisher should mind where he treads. He sat at the desk, opening the manuscript anew. Under lamplight the pages seemed to whisper secrets. Between chapter 9 and 10, a page had been neatly removed. Poirot ran a finger along the torn edge, then smiled, triumphant, as he noticed a sliver of parchment stuck beneath the binding. Carefully, he teased it out. A fragment of handwriting, Eleanor's unmistakable script. He writes in shadows. He signs with another's hand. The pen knows his name. Poirot straightened, eyes bright. So, our ghost is real, and he signs as another. But whose hand? An evening of little grey cells. Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot spread his evidence across the dining table. The envelope marked C.G. The contract draft naming Greaves as co-author. The diary warning, the truth lies between the lines. The page fragment about, the pen knows his name. He poured himself tisane and began to speak aloud, as if lecturing invisible students. Miss Vane fears her words stolen, someone rewriting her stories. Greaves seeks ownership, yes, but he lacks imagination. A thief of ink, not of art. No, there is another, a man of ego, who delights in ghosting others' thoughts. The ghostwriter. He closed his eyes. Who among them thrives unseen, yet lives by others' words? Not the publisher, not the protégé, the critic. He seized the telephone. Allo? Inspector Japp. Tomorrow we visit Oxford. Revelation at Oxford. The university hall was quiet under a pale sun. Japp had already confirmed that Dr. Lyle's lecture ended earlier than he'd claimed. The secretary remembered him leaving, in quite a hurry, around 10. Blackthorn House was only an hour's drive away. They confronted Lyle in his study. Papers covered the desk, essays, drafts, and, conspicuously, a fountain pen identical to the one found at the crime scene. Japp wasted no time. You were at the library that night. You rewrote her manuscript. And when she caught you? Lyle's composure cracked. She stole my ideas. She made her fame from my theories. I only meant to retrieve my notes, not kill her. Poirot finished gently. Yet in anger, you struck her. The nib broke, the blood spilled. Then you tried to turn her death into art, a scene from her own novel. Lyle sank into his chair, face ashen. I wanted the world to see poetic justice. She lived by deceit. Poirot shook his head. Non, monsieur. She lived by imagination. It is you who wrote deceit, upon her page, and with her blood. Japp placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. Adrian Lyle, you're under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Vane. Epilogue. 2 days later, Poirot and Japp sat once more in the quiet library. The rain had ceased, sunlight drifted across the polished floor. So that's that, Japp sighed. A critic turns killer to defend his pride. Never thought of writers as such dangerous folk. Poirot smiled. Every artist, mon ami, is dangerous when his creation turns against him. Dr. Lyle wished to live forever through words, so he killed to own them. Japp looked at the blood-stained manuscript, now sealed in evidence paper. And that line on the first page, he who writes with deceit shall die by his own words. Poirot nodded. Indeed. She wrote it days before she died, foreseeing her fate. But in the end, it became his epitaph. He rose, adjusting his hat. The case of the Scarlet Manuscript is closed. Yet remember, Japp, sometimes the sharpest murder weapon is not the knife, nor the gun, but the pen. Part 3, The Phantom Signature. Section 1, After the Confession. For 2 weeks after Dr. Adrian Lyle's arrest, London's literary world buzzed like a hive. Newspapers called it, the murder of words. The Times printed Lyle's photograph beside Eleanor Vane's, captions whispered of jealousy, plagiarism, obsession. The Spectator called the affair, a cautionary tale for writers who trade in deceit. Only one man remained unsatisfied. Hercule Poirot sat in his immaculate flat, the morning paper folded neatly beside his teacup. On the headline, Critic Confesses Two Authors' Death, he had drawn a small question mark in blue pencil. Confession, he murmured, is not always truth. It is sometimes fatigue. He opened the small leather case that contained the late Miss Vane's diary and her manuscript, now returned to him for study. The ink had faded slightly, but the faint marks beneath the text still called to him, the erased phrases, the indentations between lines. He turned again to the fragment he had found beneath the binding. He writes in shadows. He signs with another's hand. The pen knows his name. Poirot's mustaches twitched. The pen knows, he whispered. Not the writer, the pen. There was, he decided, one more visit to make. Section 2, The Manuscript Returns. That afternoon, he walked through Bloomsbury, his cane tapping briskly against the wet pavement. The offices of Greaves and Company looked strangely subdued. Clerks whispered, inkpots sat untouched. Inside, Charles Greaves rose from his desk, his face a careful mask of sympathy. Monsieur Poirot. Surely the business is concluded. The murderer has confessed. Poirot sat without invitation. Yes, so it appears. And yet, how curious that your company has already announced a posthumous edition of the Scarlet Manuscript. Greaves colored. Purely to honor Miss Vane's legacy, of course. The public demands it. And you have the completed text. Greaves hesitated. We had to reconstruct part of it. Only a few pages were damaged. Damaged, or missing. The publisher's eyes flickered. Poirot produced the sliver of paper he had rescued from the binding. The pen knows his name. Tell me, monsieur, Poirot said softly, whose pen completed the final chapter. Greaves swallowed. A member of staff, an editor, was asked to tidy the prose for publication. A routine practice. Poirot rose. Indeed? Then I must meet this editor. For I think he tidied more than prose. Section 3, The Editor in Grey. The editor was Mr. Lawrence Gray, a quiet man of 30 who worked in a corner office filled with manuscripts and dust. He greeted Poirot politely, his manner humble, his hands stained faintly with ink. I was assigned to prepare the text for printing, he explained. Miss Vane's handwriting was uneven toward the end. Poirot looked at the man's fingers. The ink stains were not fresh, but one smudge near the nail had a reddish tinge. You admire her work? Poirot asked. Very much. She wrote with precision, and pain. I felt as though I understood her better than anyone. Perhaps you did, Poirot murmured. Did you ever meet her? Gray smiled faintly. Only once, at a reading. She never remembered me. But I have copied her words for years. It is how I learn. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Copied? In what sense? Gray gestured to a drawer. Inside lay neat notebooks, each a replica of one of Eleanor Vane's novels, written entirely by his hand. I practice calligraphy, he said simply. It soothes me. Poirot closed the drawer. And yet, monsieur, you have chosen a peculiar idol. You see, Miss Vane was killed by a man who believed he could write better than she. Tell me, do you believe the same? Gray looked up, his eyes cool and distant now. Sometimes a story demands a truer ending than its author can give. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Indeed, monsieur. And perhaps you are the one who gave it. Section 4, Threads in the Web. That evening Poirot dined with Inspector Japp at Simpson's Tavern. Between mouthfuls of roast beef, Japp grumbled, I thought we'd wrapped this up neatly. Why are you stirring it again? Poirot dabbed his lips. Because the confession of Dr. Lyle explains how Miss Vane died, but not why the manuscript continued to write itself after her death. Japp stared. Continued. Poirot leaned closer. The published proofs, mon ami. 3 additional pages, perfectly imitating her hand, describe events that occurred after the moment of her death. Who could have written them? Japp frowned. Greaves said his editor polished the ending. Exactly. And that editor, Monsieur Lawrence Gray, bears the stains of ink and something darker upon his hands. You think he finished the book? I think, said Poirot, eyes glinting, he began it long before she died. Section 5, Between the Lines. The next day, Poirot obtained access to the publishing proofs. Sitting beneath the library's glass dome, he compared Eleanor Vane's authentic chapters with the final pages prepared by Gray. The difference was minute, almost invisible, but there was a rhythm, a choice of words, a subtle shift in punctuation that only the most obsessive mind would notice. On the very last page he found a tiny flourish beneath the final line, shaped like the letter G. Every signature leaves its ghost, Poirot murmured. He summoned Violet Lane to the library. "Do you recognize this symbol?" he asked, showing her the flourish. She nodded hesitantly. "Mr. Gray signs his editing notes like that. I've seen it on letters from Greaves and Company." Poirot smiled sadly. Then the ghost who haunted Eleanor Vane had a name after all. Section 6, The Trap of the Pen. That evening he arranged a small gathering at the library: Charles Greaves, Lawrence Gray, and Inspector Japp. The manuscript lay on the table like a corpse awaiting autopsy. Poirot began quietly. "Gentlemen, Dr. Lyle confessed to striking Miss Vane, yes. But his blow was not fatal. The coroner's report shows she died from poisoning, ink containing a trace of cyanide. The pen was tampered with before she ever touched it." Greaves turned pale. "Poisoned ink?" "Indeed. A rare printer's compound, used only by editors preparing proofs. The very ink you, Monsieur Gray, use daily." Gray's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Poirot continued, "After Miss Vane collapsed, Dr. Lyle panicked and fled. You, Monsieur Gray, found her body. Instead of calling for help, you saw opportunity. You dipped your pen in her blood and finished the manuscript, your manuscript." Gray's composure shattered. "She stole everything from me. I was the unseen hand behind her fame. I edited every word she wrote, reshaped every plot. She promised to name me as co-author, but she lied." Greaves sank into a chair. Japp snapped the handcuffs open. Gray whispered, almost reverently, "I only gave her the ending she deserved." Poirot said softly, "And so, monsieur, you signed your masterpiece with murder." Section 7, After the Curtain. When the police led Lawrence Gray away, the library fell silent. Outside, the wind rattled the windows like faint applause. Japp exhaled. "So that's the real ghostwriter. I'll be dashed." Poirot nodded. "Yes, mon ami. He was there from the beginning, hiding in plain sight. The true phantom was the editor, not the critic." Japp frowned. "And Dr. Lyle? He will face lesser charges. His confession came from guilt, not malice. But the ink of deceit was prepared by another hand." Poirot closed the manuscript gently. The crimson stains had dried to brown, the pages were brittle with history. "Miss Vane wrote once," he said, quoting softly, "Truth must be sealed in ink, else it bleeds through the soul." She was right. But sometimes the ink is blood, and it bleeds forever. Section 8, Epilogue, The Phantom Signature. Weeks later, the posthumous edition of the Scarlet Manuscript appeared in bookshops, its cover newly designed in black and red. On the dedication page, at Poirot's insistence, one line had been added: "To those who write honestly, and to those whose ink is their conscience." At home, Poirot placed his copy carefully upon the shelf. Then he noticed something that made him pause. Beneath the publisher's imprint, in tiny italic letters, a curved flourish shaped like a G. He smiled faintly. "Ah, the phantom leaves his mark, even from the grave. But so long as the world reads, there will always be ghosts among the words." He turned out the light. The city outside murmured like a restless story still being written. Part 4, The Ink of Silence. Section 1, Shadows in the Press. A month after the arrest of Lawrence Gray, London began to forget. New scandals bloomed daily: a duchess had vanished with a poet, a bishop was accused of gambling, the government tottered on a vote. Only in the quieter corners of Bloomsbury did whispers of the Scarlet Manuscript remain. Hercule Poirot, however, could not forget. Each morning, as sunlight touched his immaculate apartment, he found himself gazing at the shelf where that fateful book now rested. It seemed to breathe, almost, as if the story within had not yet concluded. Sometimes, when he opened a window or moved a curtain, a faint rustle came from the shelf. Once, he was certain he saw a page tremble though no breeze stirred. He told himself it was imagination. And yet, Poirot was not a man much given to imagination. That week, he received a letter sealed with unfamiliar wax, GNC Publishers, private correspondence. Inside, a single line written in a fine, angular hand. Monsieur Poirot, there is something wrong with the second edition. The words have changed. VL. He froze. Violet Lane. Section 2, The Changed Words. When he reached Greaves and Company the next day, Violet was waiting in the proofing room, pale and trembling. Before her lay 2 copies of the Scarlet Manuscript, the first edition printed weeks ago, and a new batch just off the press. "Look," she whispered. Poirot adjusted his pince-nez and leaned closer. At first, the pages appeared identical. But when he compared chapter 6 of each copy, his heart gave a little leap. In the first edition, the paragraph read, "The past is inked and cannot be erased." In the new printing, the line had become, "The past is inked, but every editor returns." Poirot frowned. "Mon Dieu," he breathed. "Who altered this?" Violet shook her head. "No one touched the plates. The compositor swears he set them exactly as before." "And yet," Poirot murmured, "the words have grown like weeds in a garden, from the same soil, but not the same seed." Section 3, The Printer's Secret. The printing foreman, a stout man named Mr. Hawley, met them downstairs. His face was as grey as the paper he printed. "Impossible," he said for the 10th time. "We cleaned the plates ourselves. No errors, no additions." Poirot gestured toward the inking rollers. "You used the same machines as before?" "Of course. Though we did have to replace one roller, the ink on the old one had gone clotted. Oddest thing I ever saw. Thick as congealed blood." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Blood, monsieur?" "Figure of speech, sir." "Still, it smelt peculiar. Almost metallic." Poirot bent to inspect the discarded roller lying by the waste bin. It was stained with a reddish-black residue. When he touched it, the surface felt faintly warm. He drew back, his voice a whisper. "It seems, my friend, that the ink remembers." Section 4, Violet's Fear. That night, Violet visited Poirot's flat at Whitehaven Mansions. Her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "do you believe in hauntings?" He smiled gently. "No, mademoiselle. I believe in people, and the crimes they commit to escape themselves." She nodded slowly. "Then explain this." From her handbag she withdrew a letter, creased and spotted with ink. Poirot unfolded it carefully. The writing was precise, too precise. The signature at the bottom made his breath catch. "Lawrence Gray." "Mademoiselle," he said quietly, "where did you find this?" "It came in the post this morning." "But he's in prison." "Or was." Poirot looked at the date. "Yesterday." Section 5, The Silence Breaks. Early the next day, Poirot and Inspector Japp visited the prison. The warden, a grim man with spectacles, shook his head in disbelief. "Gray. Found dead in his cell 3 nights ago. Suicide, swallowed cleaning solvent." Poirot felt a cold shiver. "And yet, letters do not write themselves." Japp frowned. "Could be a hoax." "Perhaps. But a hoax requires knowledge of handwriting, paper, and opportunity. Who benefits from reviving the dead editor?" Poirot's eyes fell upon the folded letter again. The ink shimmered faintly, a sheen almost oily. He touched it, then brought his finger close to his nose. A metallic tang filled his senses. "Mon ami," he murmured, "this is the same ink that killed Miss Vane." Section 6, The Hidden Manuscript. That evening, Poirot returned to the publisher's offices after hours. In Gray's abandoned workspace, the air smelled of dust and printer's oil. He opened drawers, notebooks, letters, until he found a stack of pages bound with red thread. It was a manuscript, the Scarlet Manuscript, second part. He read the first line aloud. When the editor dies, the story begins again. Poirot's heart raced. This was no posthumous edition, it was Gray's own writing, perhaps composed before his arrest. Yet how had it reached the printers now? As he turned another page, a droplet of ink fell from the margin, wet, impossibly fresh. Poirot stared. Seal, even in death, he writes. Section 7, the second signature. He carried the pages home that night, wrapped in a silk cloth, as though afraid they might breathe. By lamplight, he examined the handwriting. It was undeniably Gray's, but faint differences in the slant and spacing caught his eye. And there, beneath the title, 2 words chilled him. As told to me by V.L. Violet Lane. He sat motionless for a long moment. Could the young secretary, frightened and loyal, have become another vessel for Gray's obsession? Or had someone else, someone alive, continued his work? He thought of the printing roller, the self-writing letters, the smell of blood in ink. Poirot whispered, perhaps the ink has found a new hand. Section 8, the library at midnight. 2 nights later, he received another message slipped beneath his door. No signature, only a line written in that same metallic ink. If you wish to see truth, come to the library at midnight. Poirot arrived precisely on time. The Blackthorn library was dark except for a faint light in the reading room. Violet stood there, trembling, holding a fountain pen. I didn't mean to, Monsieur Poirot, she whispered. It just happens. When I touch the pen, it moves. She placed it on the desk. The pen twitched once, then began to write across a blank page. The words formed in elegant script. Do not blame her. The editor returns. Poirot stepped forward, calm but resolute. Enough of this theater. Mademoiselle, someone has devised a cruel trick, ink laced with phosphor and mercury salts, reacting to heat. It writes by chemical pressure, not spirits. Violet's tears glimmered. Then why does it write my name? Poirot looked down. The pen had stopped. The final word on the page was indeed Violet, in Gray's hand. Section 9, Truth in the Ink. Later, at his apartment, Poirot laid out every document, Vane's diary, Gray's forged pages, Violet's letter, and the mysterious new manuscript. He stared for hours, tracing patterns only he could see. At dawn, his eyes widened. The repeated letters, the capital V's and L's throughout the new manuscript, formed a code. When he arranged them sequentially, the hidden message read. Violet Lane is not who she claims to be. Poirot leaned back, astonished. Mon Dieu! The phantom editor was not alone. Section 10, The Silence Ends. That afternoon, he invited Violet to tea. Mademoiselle, he said gently, tell me the truth. Who are you really? She froze. Then her eyes softened with weary surrender. My name is Violet Lyle, she said at last. Adrian's sister. Poirot nodded slowly. Then all becomes clear. You joined the publishers to watch Eleanor Vane, the woman your brother despised. But instead of hatred, you found admiration. You saw her talent, her pain. Violet whispered, I wanted to protect her work. When Gray began to alter it, I tried to stop him. But after his death, I couldn't let it end there. I thought if I finished his story, it would end his hold over me. Instead, it continued. Poirot smiled sadly. Yes, mademoiselle. Because guilt writes as fiercely as love. You tried to silence the ink, but it spoke your own secrets. He stood, carefully placing his hand over hers. Now, let it rest. Burn the pen. End the story. She nodded, tears falling onto the pages. One drop touched the ink, and the letters began to dissolve, fading into blank whiteness. Poirot watched quietly. At last, he murmured, the ink of silence. Epilogue, the quiet shelf. Months later, the scandal was forgotten. A single copy of the Scarlet Manuscript remained on Poirot's shelf, unchanging, finally still. No letters moved, no ghostly words appeared. When the sunlight struck its spine, the crimson ink gleamed faintly, like a wound healed at last. Poirot poured himself a cup of chocolate and smiled. Perhaps, after all, he said, every story must have silence at its end. Part 5, the final page. Section 1, The Quiet Before Truth. Spring arrived in London like a cautious apology. The fog still rolled over the Thames, but crocuses pushed through the cracks of pavements, and even Whitehaven mansions smelled faintly of polish and renewal. Hercule Poirot sat at his breakfast table, gazing at the single crimson volume that had haunted him for months. The Scarlet Manuscript now lay motionless, its ink stilled, yet, to the detective's mind, a single question still fluttered unanswered: who began the story? For crimes, like novels, must have an author. He turned to the last page once more. Beneath the printer's mark, invisible except in certain light, a pattern of minute pinholes crossed the paper, a code formed by the typesetter's gauge. Poirot leaned closer, eyes brightening. There were two sets of holes, one older, one newly drilled. Ah, he whispered, two endings, one buried beneath the other. Section 2, The Printer's Visit. That afternoon a nervous knock sounded. Mr. Hawley, the printing foreman, stood at the door, hat twisting in his hands. "I didn't want to trouble you, sir, but we found something odd." From his pocket he produced a small brass compositor's plate, pitted and dark with age. On it were engraved 5 words. "Property of E. Vane, not to be set." Hawley explained, it was wedged behind the press. "Must have fallen years ago. But there's more. When I cleaned it, another line appeared beneath, scratched by hand. Unless by A.L. Poirot's brows rose. A.L. Adrian Lyle. So, Eleanor Vane herself had restricted part of her work, and allowed it only to be handled by the very man once accused of her murder. Section 3, The Hidden Draft. With Japp's reluctant permission, Poirot visited the Lyle estate outside Oxford. The critic's sister, Violet Lyle, now free of the pen's obsession, guided him through dusty halls until they reached the late doctor's study. There, in a locked drawer, lay a thin notebook. On its cover, E.V., Notes for Revision. Inside were fragments of sentences, crossings out, and in the center a complete paragraph written in Eleanor Vane's hand. "Should my editor betray me, I shall leave the truth within my words. The letters themselves will speak." Poirot examined the paragraph carefully, then smiled. The initial letters of each sentence formed an acrostic, LAURNCEGREY. The murdered author had discovered her editor's deceit long before her death, and she had hidden his name inside the text itself. "She wrote her own confession," Poirot murmured, but no one thought to read between the lines. Section 4, The Publisher's Sin. Charles Greaves tried to feign innocence when Poirot confronted him in his office. But beneath the detective's unrelenting gaze, the publisher's composure cracked. "Yes," Greaves admitted at last. "I knew Gray had altered her chapters. But the changes sold books. When she threatened to expose us, Gray came to me, said he would silence her in ink. I thought he meant legally, a re-edit, not," he swallowed hard. "When the scandal broke, I destroyed the correspondence. I couldn't ruin the company." Poirot's voice was soft. "And so you printed lies in place of truth. You profited from the death of a woman who wrote your fortune." Greaves whispered, "Will you expose me?" Poirot looked toward the rain-streaked window. "No, monsieur. The law will deal with you. But your conscience will print its own editions every night." Section 5, The Final Revelation. Back in his flat, Poirot arranged all the evidence upon the table. The coded manuscript, the brass plate, the acrostic, the poisoned ink. He traced their pattern with a gloved finger, a perfect circle of guilt, each name feeding the next. Vane discovered Gray's fraud. Gray killed Vane. Greaves concealed the crime. Violet revived the manuscript, and through it all, the ink carried every secret forward, like blood in a vein. He wrote in his notebook, the murderer sought to rewrite a life. But the story, being true, rewrote him instead. At last he took out his silver pen, unscrewed it, and poured every remaining drop of crimson ink into the fireplace. The flames hissed, a faint metallic scent rose, then faded. Et voilà, he said softly. The ghost is edited out. Section 6, A Visit from Japp. Inspector Japp called that evening, trench coat dripping from the rain. Well, Poirot, it's all in the papers again. Greaves is finished, the Lyle girl cleared. You've wrapped up another chapter in style. Poirot chuckled. Non, mon ami. I have merely turned the page. The story itself, that belongs to the world now. Japp grinned. You and your stories. Sometimes I think you love the words more than the criminals. Perhaps, said Poirot. Because the words, they never lie. It is only the men who write them. Section 7, The Last Dedication. Weeks later, a new edition of the Scarlet Manuscript appeared, corrected at last, free of forgeries. On the first page stood a fresh dedication penned by Poirot himself. To Truth, which edits all things. The book sold modestly, quietly. But those who read it swore that, if left open under sunlight, faint lines appeared in the margins, invisible sentences spelling out the author's own justice. Perhaps it was merely a trick of ink, perhaps something more. Section 8, Epilogue, The story ends. One golden morning, Poirot set out his breakfast tray and found a small envelope slipped beneath his door. No address, no seal, only a sheet of blank paper inside. As he turned it, light revealed a single watermark in the shape of a quill. He smiled. Ah, Mademoiselle Vane, you have your peace now. He placed the paper inside the book and closed it gently. The room filled with silence, rich and perfect, the silence of an ending honestly earned. Poirot straightened his tie, smoothed his mustache, and said to the empty room. Every story, even mine, must end upon the final page. Then he turned out the lamp. End of Hercule Poirot and the Scarlet Manuscript.